For this video, I'd like to talk about Divinity Original Sin 2. It's a top-down RPG by a company called Larian, and it takes place about 1,000 years after the events of the first game. One of its biggest selling points for me was that it's considered to be a standalone sequel, meaning that you shouldn't have to play the previous games to understand the current one. The Elder Scrolls games work this way. I say shouldn't have to because, well, we're gonna get into that, I suppose. In all fairness though, it does do an okay job of separating itself from the first game, which I should know because I have not played the first game.
This looks like the crate I'm after. But where are the contents?
I think that's important to state in case any of my criticism is based on something that's explained or resolved in the first game. Despite the title, this is also not the second game in the series, it's closer to the fifth, including a separate game obnoxiously called Divinity 2. Apparently the sins in that game were unoriginal. Before we get into spoilers, I'm going to give a brief synopsis as well as giving my general feedback on the game, just in case you'd like to try it before I spoil it. My quick answer to whether I like this game or not is that while it has most of the pieces of a truly amazing game, it just didn't put them together properly.
Nothing like a nice tentacle slap across the moor to set the tone for the week, eh?
I enjoyed many aspects of the game. The graphics are amazing, the gameplay is fun, there's a huge variety of content, but I never felt engaged. Yeah, I guess I liked it, but I definitely didn't love it. In terms of mechanics, the game only ever crashed a small handful of times, and although I did have to force a reload because an event trigger locked me in a room, other than that, I never really had any critical technical issues. The biggest issue I had was just that the story felt so flat and cliched to me.
I can't be seen raternizing with the likes of you.
There's an issue I have with a lot of stories, be it movies, games, books, whatever, which I call the just so happen to clause. The more I have to use the phrase just so happen to describe the events of a story, the less I'm going to enjoy it. Coincidences are fine when they're used sparingly, but this game goes way overboard, as you'll probably see. A lot of the story in this game uses that concept, which is why I think I could never really get into it. And the worst part about it is it's not even a really complex or interesting story once you dissect it. There's a bunch of creatures invading from a place called the Void, led by a giant evil god. The good gods want to stop this and have granted you superpowers so that you can help them. That's pretty much it for a surface level description. The rest of the game is just developing these powers and in the end deciding how you want to use them to solve the problem. And yeah, I mean, change Void to Hell and suddenly you have the plot to the Diablo series. Which isn't to say that simple and unoriginal is bad, it just didn't grab me the way an RPG game like this should.
Well, on to plan B.
I can't say much more without getting into spoilers, so let's head in that direction. Up front, I want to mention that for the convenience of my recorded playthroughs, I used 3 mods. One granting me the Pet Pal trait and permanent spirit vision, one allowed me to level up to max and gain all skills, and the last increased my movement speed. I'll link them in the description. I also had the Sir Laura DLC installed, which I hated, and was prepared to complain about until I realized that it was just DLC that I didn't know I had, and since it's optional, I'm not going to get into it.
Someday, the great acorn will fall again.
Before you begin, you have your choice of character. Each character has their own backstory, which leads to their personal questline. Right off the bat, none of the stories really grabbed me. A few, like the Red Prince, sounded okay on its surface level description, but as soon as I heard him talk about his backstory, I immediately wanted nothing to do with him.
Famed, of course, for my unique red skin and unparalleled skills as a general of the House of War.
In the end, I chose Losa. Her character has a demon that's constantly trying to take over her body, and she's fighting to get rid of it. Not bad, I suppose.
I've got this under control!
After you pick your character, you start out on a boat, headed for a prison colony called Fort Joy. You're shown to be collared with something that blocks your source powers. Okay, so we already need to take our first sidestep in the story. So what the hell is source? Well, in this game you have spells, called skills. You have an astoundingly large number of them, and they're all unique and can interact with each other. Very cool. Source skills are a small handful of more powerful versions of those skills. Also, I'm sure someone at Larian thought they were being awfully clever calling it Source, which is no doubt named after the word sorcerer. Source spells cost source points, so in order to use source spells, you have to build up your source, which is done primarily by finding puddles of green liquid on the ground. I have several issues with source in general, but for now let's just say that they're more powerful spells that you're being blocked from using. You walk throughout the boat before you come across an old woman, who breaks her source collar and summons a giant kraken. Oh right, I should also mention that using Source supposedly attracts creatures called Voidwoken, which are monsters from the Void, which, even without my Diablo reference, is a pretty straight analogy to Hell, with Voidwoken being like demons, even though this game also has demons. Okay, so the Kraken starts to destroy the ship and you have to make it to the life rafts. At the last moment, a small child asks if you want to go back and save your future companions before you leave. Now, if there's another thing that really bugs me about stories like this in games, it's when it's on rails. Meaning that no matter what choice you make, the plot only has one way for it to continue forward. And I'm not talking about just linear plots, those are fine. I'm talking about a game giving you significant choices and then taking them away again when you didn't make the choice that it wanted. This game is full of that. The reason I mention it now is because despite the narrative weight, this decision is entirely meaningless going forward. You can choose to abandon your future companions and leave immediately. You can stay and join them fighting off the Voidwoken and escape together, or you can even go down below decks and personally murder every single one of them, leaving the Voidwoken untouched, and the only thing it changes is the initial dialogue when you meet up with all of them on the beach moments later, completely alive and unharmed. This is what we call rails. Anyway, the Kraken wrecks the ship and you're hurtled into the water. And you're approached by your deity who calls you back to life to, well, who knows. They just say that they have plans for you.
I have plans for you, child.
Good enough, I guess. You wake up on the beach. This is the beach outside of Fort Joy. You can explore a bit and find a few of the companions that you met and maybe murdered earlier. They thank you for saving them or complain that you didn't, and then you make your way toward Fort Joy together.
To act all high and mighty after what you've done.
Before you arrive at Fort Joy, you come across this group of people. 2 humans, Dallas the Hammer and Bishop Alexander, and a lizard woman named Atusa. They accuse Atusa of lying about something and then kill her. Then they just walk away and refuse to talk to you. You head into the camp and find a few more companions, and your task becomes clear. Escape Fort Joy. There are a few ways that you can do this. You can murder, sneak, or talk your way through, but one important thing is that if you make it into the fort itself, you can find some of the Magisters performing an evil ritual. So, the loose story so far is that using source powers supposedly draws Voidwoken. So this group, called the Magisters, were bringing every sorcerer in the world here so that they could destroy their connection to the source. The issue is that their connection to the source seems to also be connected to their soul or something. So when the procedure is complete, they become these silent monks that are just obedient slaves. As if you needed any more reason to just murder them all and move on.
The creature before you stares with sightless eyes and leans from side to side.
After you get past the fort, the main plot takes a backseat to the menagerie of side quests in the area, most of which are unrelated to the main objective. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip talking about these, but just for reference, you can kill a witch, help a collective of people escape, rescue an imprisoned dragon, rescue some pigs that are permanently on fire, etc. In the end, you find these things called Purging Wands, which are the Deus Ex Machina to defeat the otherwise completely invulnerable defenses, these monsters that the Magisters created called Shriekers, which just kill you in one hit if you get too close to them. Finally, you make it to the coast, kill Bishop Alexander, who is trying to stop you from escaping for some reason, and escape the island via a ship that happened to be docked nearby with the help of a half-demon lady called Malady. At this point, you would have heard the term Godwoken a number of times, and even been called it a few of those times.
Godwoken.
The game doesn't really explain what it means yet, or ever really, but the basic idea is that there are 7 gods, one for each race, and each one has a chosen champion among the mortals. The weird part is they never really explain what being Godwoken actually does for you. It seems like everybody has the ability to speak with their god, even if they don't usually listen, and you already have Source before you become Godwoken, so aside from the title, I don't know what the big deal is. But it's sure as hell a big deal to the bad guys, because everyone wants to kill you now. So you're on this ship, and Malady tells you that it won't move, and that it's up to you to figure out why not. In the basement, you can find Alexander again, and it turns out that you only nearly killed him. So you can do whatever you want with that information, and then move on to figuring out the ship. Well, it turns out that the ship is sentient, and it will only move if you sing it a specific song, like a password, or pass song in this case. In order to get to the song, you have to pass the sentient door, on the sentient ship, by tricking it into telling you its own password. Whatever. Anyway, you get the song, you get the ship moving. Dallas, the previous captain of the ship, apparently saw that you were stealing her ship, found a way to the town that you're now sailing towards, put herself in charge of a similar ship, and then sailed back to intercept you. I had no idea it took so long to get past the sentient door, but sure. She crashes her new ship into her old ship and summons a bunch of creatures to fight you. Malady immediately declares that the fight is unwinnable, and after a few rounds of fighting, she teleports everyone, boat and all, to the Hall of Echoes, which is kinda purgatory, I guess? This is actually probably the second time that you've been here. The first time for some characters was just before you got on the boat and was just your god telling you that you were their chosen godwoken. This time, your god tells you that the void is breaking through, void spawn are coming, and it's your job to stop it all. They grant you the ability to cast Bless and send you back to the boat. Eventually, you come splashing back into the ocean just outside of a town called Driftwood, and Malady tells you that there's a person in town that can help explain things a bit better. You head in town and arrive just as she's about to be killed. Her name is Maester Siva, by the way. You rescue her, or don't, it doesn't really change anything. Then you head into her basement and speak with your god again. Your god tells you to do some side quests until you're powerful enough to become the next super god. In a nutshell, whichever godwoken wins a trial, they grant even super powers, and the title of the Divine, so that they can protect the world from the voidwoken. So you explore the map, kill some enemies, and you go around making deals with local sorcerers to grant you higher capacity for source. So at this point, there are three major factions that you've seen. Paladins, who seem to genuinely want to help people, Magisters, who seem to genuinely want to hurt and torture people, and the Black Ring, who genuinely want to resurrect Diablo. The God King. Whatever. Once you have enough source, you talk to your god again and they reveal the location of the Nameless Isle. The Nameless Isle is a place that's hidden to ordinary folk. The only way to find it is to know where it is already. Your god granted you the ability to get here once they decided that you were powerful enough, which is what makes it all the more surprising when you show up and it's already populated with Paladins and Magisters and Black Ring, a bunch of random bosses and assassins, and an entire city of elves. Oh, and Alexander's already here too. Regardless of whether you killed him once or twice, he'll be here. He says he's already figured out how to get into the Ascension Room and he can ascend at any time. Just not, now. Nah, I'll become a god later. I got more important things to do.
I do not need to work with you.
You make your way up to the Ascension Room, which is apparently called the Council, and solve a quick puzzle to unlock the door. You're all standing around at the entrance and finally decide to call a meeting. In all the rush to find this place, you still haven't decided what to do once you got here. For some reason that's never explained, there can only be one divine, and of course everyone wants to be the next one.
I must ascend.
You're set up to convince everyone that you're the rightful person to ascend, and that they either support you or leave your party, and you can never get them back. However, I was still playing as Losa and figured that I was the last person who should be ascending since I still had a demon partially controlling me. You could literally be helping a crazy powerful demon ascend to the throne of godhood, and no one cares or even mentions this when you try to convince them to support you. So I started telling everybody that I'd support them, figuring, hey, anyone but me. And they all got pissed at me for supporting people that weren't them. So I reloaded my save and I chose Alexander. He's already apparently immortal, so yeah, fuck you, party members. Funny enough, even if you've killed all of your party members throughout the game and ensured that they cannot be here, they're here anyway, albeit as skeletons like Fane. They apparently all make a deal with the God King for their lives, which doesn't make any sense thematically for any of them, but the game couldn't possibly allow you off of these tracks. It doesn't really matter anyway, though, because the inspired challenge designed to test the best and bravest people in the land and ensure that they're strong enough to be the next divine and gain the collective powers of all the gods is a very short foot race. It took me one turn to make it to the end, and I wasn't even going for Divinity. But even that doesn't matter, because at the very end of the race, just before you can ascend, Dallas teleports in with a whole squad of enemies and just blows up the Ascension device. She hurls an insult at you and then just teleports away again before you can react.
Goodbye.
Then your god shows up for some reason and tries to murder you. You kill them back with relative ease and sit around lamenting the whole situation. And then the whole facility starts to crumble into fire because, of course it does. And then Malady teleports in with a ship again. You climb on and she teleports you all back to the Hall of Echoes. This whole sequence of events is the biggest clusterfuck in the game, and I cannot imagine what was happening with the writing. It requires so many just so happen tos, and it's like they wrote the end first and then wrote everything up to the Ascension Room, and they just ran out of time and just had to blast through the section to have it make sense with the outcome they wanted. So anyway, you're back on the ship and Malady laments the loss of the Divinity machine and tells you that the gods are all dead now. I don't know how she could know that, but I guess yours was the last one. She says we're headed to a city called Arx to confront Dallas, with no mention of how she knows that Dallas went there or why she's certain that she'll stay there, but whatever. Now, I'd like to take a quick break here to mention awkward sex scenes in video games. Yes, there's one coming up and we're going to skip over most of it, but the first word that comes to my mind is inexplicable. Normally when it comes to these kinds of scenes in video games, there's at least some kind of lead up to it. During your travels and adventures, you're constantly talking about things and getting to know each other. It's usually also something that if you don't go out of your way to accomplish, you might never know it was there. Here, you literally have a menu of people that you can sleep with, and as far as I know, as long as you did their side quest, which you probably found and completed by accident, they'll all say yes. Even the sentient ship gets involved. It apparently senses the mood and builds you a little dungeon on the fly. Why is this in here? It then continues to this awkwardly narrated and detailed scene, and yeah, it just feels so out of place in a game that barely hinted at romance from the start. Anyway, Malady starts her spell to teleport you all to Arx, but oh no, the spell goes haywire and the ship crashes just outside the city. This event seems entirely designed to show that Malady isn't the omnipotent entity that she's been played out to be this whole time, which, who really cares at this point? It's completely irrelevant anyway, since this is the last place you need to go, so you don't need the ship anymore. But even then, Malady has this throwaway line about how she managed to save the ship's spirit or something, so you can still use the ship anyway. Ah, the great city of Arx. Well, except that the moment you arrive, it just so happens to be under attack by Voidwoken. You kill them and hopefully save some paladins who thank you and tell you that they're investigating and killing all the magisters. At this point, you have to deal with the paladins a bit, since the main story relies on them, sorta. You find out that Dallas is likely somewhere around the grave of Lucian, the last divine, and some sources suggest that he's still alive. In order to get in, you have to get past the Path of Blood, which is a trial that kills just about everyone and definitely will kill you. In order to bypass it, you have to find the Caretaker. He's been kidnapped by a paladin who is a Black Ring member in disguise, so you head to his basement and free the Caretaker. On the way, you pick up a magic amulet that will help you and have to fight some animated toys. I wanted to mention this part in particular because it has one of the best battle songs in the game, and as far as I know, unless you play as Beast, this short battle is the only time it's used. It's certainly the only time I ever heard of it, and it just seems like a waste. So you bypass the Path of Blood and head to the crypt. Immediately you have to solve this puzzle, and I have no idea why. There were no major puzzles in the game until now, but suddenly it's a puzzle game. Plus it makes no sense thematically. The Path of Blood literally kills everyone who tries to access this with basically no exceptions. Why would you suddenly need to have a Pipe Mania style puzzle here? And really, this would have been much better served as a test to gain Divinity. You solve it and head into the next section, and it's another puzzle. Animated toys again, but you have to spell out the word power for some reason with these levers, which is entirely obnoxious on its own, especially when you're locked into turns, but even worse that the toys are trying to mess you up. Anyway, you complete the puzzle and head into the final room. The big finale. You walk in and Lucian begins speaking to you. Yes, he's still alive, and yes, you definitely knew that long before getting here. He spends 30 seconds and explains the entire plot. Essentially, there's a barrier made of pure source between Rivellon and the Void. The 8 ancient lords stole a bunch of source to make themselves the gods, and because of that, there's now a hole in the barrier where the Voidwoken can get through. In order to save the world from the Voidwoken, we need to take every bit of source from the world and jam it back into the hole to clog the leak. That means sacrificing yourself to become one of those silent monks with no soul. Temporarily glossing over a ton of inconsistencies, Dallas's pal Vredeman reveals himself to be Brachus Rex, the tyrant left over from the previous game who was literally and figuratively resurrected for this game. He breaks free, summons the Kraken from the beginning, and you begin the final battle. If you agreed to sacrifice your source, you fight alongside Dallas and Lucian, otherwise you have to fight them at the same time as Brachus and the Kraken. Once you win the fight, you have the option to sit in what I guess is the new Divinity chair. The strange thing is, even if Lucian's still alive and you sided with him before, you're still presented with this option as if he didn't exist. He offers no protest to you just taking Divinity from him. You are then once again given a menu of options of how you want to proceed. You can plug the source hole like Lucian wanted, you can become the next divine and fight the Void, you can allow the God King and the Voidwoken to take over the world, or you can make everyone in the world equal sorcerers and empower them to fight the Void. Whichever you choose, you get a cinematic detailing what happens and then end up back on the boat. The Arx chapter ended up being much shorter than I expected. It kinda seemed like they rushed this section, and most of the main quest here feels like contrived delays. And by the way, this woman talking in the cutscenes is named Windigo. Windigo? And in case you're wondering what makes her character important enough to warrant narrating all of the cutscenes, you aren't alone, because I'm wondering that as well. She's never a main or side character, she's just an NPC that you bump into and kill a few times, and as far as I can tell, her most notable interaction is that she summons the Voidwoken that destroys the boat in the beginning. Why isn't Lucian voicing them? Or Brachus Rex? Even Dallas would have made more sense, and she's the one that's been following you around for the whole game. Anyway, back on the boat you can talk to Malady, and she'll either be delighted that you're now divine and can help her do whatever, or she's annoyed that you gave up divinity or purged all source. Remember how I said earlier that if you decide to go along with the plan to purge all source, including your own, that you'd lose your soul and become a silent monk? Yeah, well, technically that happens, but the cinematic tells you that Malady took pity on you and Deus Ex'd your soul back together minus the source or something, so apparently that can happen.
She restored them to life.
And that's really the end of the story as it's presented. And I just want to take a moment to go over some stuff that happened in the background, as there's a lot of lore in this game, and some of it's actually important to understand the ending and just how bad it was. So, before the Divinity series took place, there was only one race, called the Eternals. They were a very advanced society technologically, and one of their scientists, Fane, the same Fane that you can play as, found out about the Veil, which is where the source comes from. The king, who's now called the God King, but it doesn't say what he used to be called, understood the risk and banned Fane from doing any more research on it. However, the 8 lords who heard about it went power mad and convinced Fane to tell them about it. They ended up tapping into the source to empower themselves, and then for some reason that is never explained, used that power to toss every other Eternal, as well as the God King, into the void on the other side, and then patched it up as best they could. Only Fane and a few others managed to avoid it. So then we fast forward a bit. The Eternals in the Void were pretty pissed off about that, and they tried to fight their way back to their home. However, their time in the Void has changed them, and now they're vengeful monsters, thus the Voidwoken. In the meantime, the gods, now only 7, created all new sentient races to inhabit the world and somehow generate even more source for them, which the gods could then consume when that creature died.
When they die, the gods feed from them. It's an ingenious system.
Yeah. However, even in their powers combined, they couldn't stop the Void from invading, mostly because they would never bother to work together, so they all agreed to create the Divine, someone that they could all give up a bunch of their power to and who could focus on stopping the Void while they bickered amongst themselves. Lucian eventually became the Divine and figured out that the gods were assholes and decided to work against them. At some point before this, he unleashed the Death Fog, which was pretty much exactly what it sounds like, on the Elven homeland, which killed most of the elves. This weakened the Elven god enough that the Void was able to get a pretty significant foothold. He then teamed up with Dallas, who's actually an Eternal and is Fane's daughter apparently, and through her he found out about the Void and all the rest. So, Lucian fakes his death and starts working on taking down the gods, while Dallas rounds up all the sorcerers and purges them of their source under the guise that they were responsible for the Voidwoken attacks. The God King then enlists some people through whatever means to help the Void's cause, and they called themselves the Black Ring. All of the stuff with the Magisters and Paladins is just Dallas and Lucian manipulation. Their plan was to kill everyone who had Source and capture it within this kind of ancient staff thing, and then use it to heal the Veil back to full strength so they could be rid of the Void forever. Now, as far as evil plans to save the world go, this isn't too bad. There are several really annoying issues with it for me, though. Giving up your Source to steal off the Veil is clearly supposed to be the right thing to do, and the game urges you to accept that. But Lucian stops short of expressing any form of regret or emotion towards what he's doing, just constantly expressing the greater good mentality, which made me kind of suspicious of him, and really threw me off this idea because what he was doing went way beyond simply killing all the sorcerers for the greater good. Remember those Shriekers from earlier? Yeah, they were created by torturing a sorcerer until their pain was so overwhelming that they lost their minds and now channel an insane amount of source at whatever living creature is near them, destroying them instantly.
A sorcerer, crucified and tortured.
Remember, sorcerers aren't evil by nature. These are just innocent people that are being tortured to death in unbelievable pain for the sake of creating what amounts to a guard tower. But yeah, think of the greater good. In the basement of Fort Joy, you can find a man that Dallas recruited into the Magisters who's experimenting on torturing living people in order to turn them into mindless golems, probably in order to create more bodyguards for Dallas or intimidating foot soldiers for the Magisters. And this is just the first area of the game. And after all of that, the good ending of this game is to validate all of that by giving up your source and letting Lucian carry on. Lucian announces that he plans to re-emerge at the end of all of this and regain his throne as the Divine, albeit a false Divine since he'd have to give up his source as well.
False Divine, of course. I shall have no power.
The context when you talk to them is that all of this was necessary, but why? Lucian keeps talking about the great sacrifices he's had to make and will continue to make, but is it really a sacrifice if the only repercussions you face is that it helps advance your agenda and install you as the ruler of everyone? Even at the very end, when he would need to finally make a sacrifice, he apparently doesn't. Don't forget that Lucian himself is a sorcerer. He has to give up his source in order to complete his plan, but he never addresses the issue that doing so would make him a silent monk as well. He has plans for what he's going to be doing after. He's going to become emperor of everyone again, so he fully expects to retain his soul even after you've had to give up yours. He's going to accept all of the credit and take none of the responsibility so that people will worship him again and he can demand peace. And this is the good option. And I don't have any idea why they didn't just say that he'd have to sacrifice himself as well for his plan to work. Not only would that make his position more sympathetic, but it also doesn't even make sense for him to come back. Even if he somehow manages to dodge the silent monk issue, he's an older man who wouldn't be immortal anymore. He's going to start aging again, and pretty quickly people are going to figure out the ruse. Then what happens when he dies again? This whole ending issue makes me think that the person writing it wanted one of those edgy, every answer is wrong sort of plot hooks. But it just doesn't work here, especially given how much the game urges you toward that Lucian plan. Alright, so let's talk about Source for a minute. Source is supposedly this otherworldly power, something that, when you harness enough of it, you can do basically anything. As an example, when the 8 Lords first harnessed Source, they used it to teleport every other Eternal as well as the God King into another dimension, and then created 8 completely new sentient races with souls designed as Source generators. And yet, when you harness Source, the best you can do is mildly better versions of existing spells. Keep in mind that every person in Divinity's world is able to learn and cast these spells and skills. The only thing that sets you apart as a sorcerer is your ability to cast a very limited number of source spells in extremely limited amount of times. Remember too, casting source spells uses your source points, which are somewhat rare in the game, so you're not going to be spamming them. Now why is this an issue, you may be wondering? It makes sense that the most powerful spells have limited uses, except that the entire plot of the game is based around you having the ability to cast these spells freely. The only time you can even recharge your source is to step into a puddle of source, which grants you 1 source point. There are a few locations scattered throughout the game where you can recharge your source infinitely, but they aren't exactly that quick to get to and use, so it's not something you're going to be doing between each battle unless you're okay with adding a significant amount of boring downtime to your playthrough. And pretty much every guard or soldier from every faction in the game wants to kill source users anyway, so maybe you just never cast them, right? Then your enemies would never know. Well, they just so happen to train dogs to be able to smell the source on you. Yeah, apparently your magical spirit energy gives off a very distinct odor, even when it's completely depleted. How unlucky for you. But to bring it back around to the plot, even Lucian seems to be unable to utilize source to any significant extent. Lucian spent his time draining the source from the gods and then killing them all, gaining their source plus all the source generated from all the people who have died since this whole thing started. He has more source piled up than all of the gods combined, and they were able to individually utilize it to recreate the world with all new sentient life forms in it, and yet he can't use it to solve even the mundane problems that he's dealing with. The excuse that he's hiding from the gods only holds up as long as the gods are alive, and even after they're dead, he's still hiding in the tomb and has to ask you to give up your source. If the gods could use source to create everyone, he should surely be able to use it to remove all of the sorcerers without having to torture them. And if you tell him no, you won't give up your source, you have to fight and defeat him. The literal summation of all godlike power in the world, and you can beat him with regular spells that any asshole can cast. As an aside, you may be wondering, if your regular spells are so powerful that you don't need the source spells, wouldn't it break the game from the beginning? Like, why don't you just kill all the Fort Joy guards in the beginning and then break out instead of sneaking through the castle? Well, you can, and in my first playthrough I did, with very little trouble. I didn't mean to do it, though I certainly felt justified after certain events. In fact, let me take a moment and go over that event real quick. You see this cat? This cat started following me early in the game for seemingly no reason. I very much enjoyed this and endeavored to find him some food or shelter or something. Well, only a few minutes after he started following me around, this happened. Now, like any normal, sane, rational individual, my first thought was, well, now I'm murdering them all. And I did, with relative ease. Turns out this crazy stronghold where they decided to bring all of the most powerful magic users in the world could be taken down completely by a couple of them working together using regular spells. There's basically never a time in the game that you can't proceed by just murder hoboing everyone. And bringing it back around again, the ending video is just so reverent toward the Lucian plan that it really ruins the atmosphere. Like seriously, the judgment at the end is that you have done nothing the whole game except hinder Lucian's plans, which caused more and more people to die. If you had just died at Fort Joy, then their plan would have succeeded much sooner, and the world would have been much better off. Great message, thanks. And all the other endings just reinforce this. If you choose to take Divinity for yourself, the ending narrative is that the war with the Void just keeps getting worse and it blames you for choosing that option. If you distribute Source evenly to everyone and empower them all to fight the Void, they eventually turn on each other and the narrative blames you again. If you play as Fane, you can actually choose to bring back the Eternals, who, of course, immediately enslave everyone, and you have no choice but to be an evil slaver, even if you played a generally good-aligned game otherwise. This is just more of the rails that I was talking about earlier. Even though it lets you pick all of these options and actually stick with them this time, it's quick to judge you and condescendingly spout out, "Is that really what you wanted?"
Did you regret becoming divine?
The Lucian ending is the only one with a positive outcome. Everyone lives happily ever after, so I guess ignorance saves the world. You know how I keep saying that this game's on rails? Let me expand on that slightly. Every dialogue has roughly 3 or more options to give you the illusion of choice, but with the exception of that ending dialogue, there is virtually no significant decisions that you can make in regards to the main story, and there are very few significant choices you can make in the entire game at all. I should clarify too, decision might not be the best word for it, because there are a lot of decisions you can make. That one in the beginning where you save your companions or murder them, it's technically a decision, it just doesn't have any impact, and that's how most of them go. You make a decision, and then 1 or 2 characters reference it at some point, but that's it. It doesn't change anything. The biggest impact from the decision that I found was in the basement of Arx. You can find a Doomsday device as part of a quest. You have the option of unleashing it on Arx or venting it harmlessly into the sea, and if you unleash it on Arx, you can return to the surface and everyone's dead. Or should I say, everyone not plot-related is dead. This is probably the most significant change to the game, and all it really does is remove a lot of the side quests and NPCs. Still, I give it credit. It's nice that you can alter the state of the game through some means. The last plot-related thing that I wanted to bring up is the individual characters themselves. When you first start, you can either pick a pre-made character or you can create your own. If you go to create your own, the game strongly encourages you to go back and choose a preset character because they have full storylines to go along with the main quest, and the custom character will only have the main quest to follow. I seriously don't know why you couldn't just customize an existing character. It's not like they're ever shown or mentioned in any of the cinematics, so it would change nothing. It didn't really matter to me anyway, since most of the stories are pretty lame. Like I mentioned before, I chose Lohse because her story was the only one that really stuck out to me. And to be quite honest, this may have been the nail in the coffin for the main quest on its own. Lohse's better-than-average story involves a demon that's partially possessing her and trying to take over her mind. That's fairly intriguing, but it creates another problem. It was just a constant reminder to me of how not intriguing the main story was. Fighting the literal manifestation of your inner demon is a vastly more interesting story than this drawn-out ascension to pseudo-godhood. But the game is written in such a way to push you towards the main quest at every turn. And every time there's a little bit of intrigue about her and her demon, it takes a back seat to the game pushing you towards this main plot. Oh yes, I'll help you get rid of your demon, but first do some main quest missions for me. Oh, looks like I can't help you. Oh, but I can help you. But do some missions for me first. Actually, I can't help you yet. Keep going. It's always trying to shoo you back to the main plot, even though, as I mentioned earlier, there is no reason at all for you to become the Divine while you still have a demon controlling you. Fane's story had its own weird aspect. Fane is a skeleton, and when you choose him, the game pops up a warning that his route will be far more difficult because anyone who sees him without a mask on will be scared of him. What it means in reality is that anytime you're not wearing a helmet in the game, every single non-plot related character in the game will just attack you on sight, and I could find no other difference. It is absolutely not a problem though, because once you put a helmet on, there's literally never a reason in game to take it off. And as long as you're wearing one, everyone just treats you like you're a human. And what's really weird about these characters is that they're a completely different person when you play as them versus having them in your party. When you play as them, most of their dialogue is limited to generic script, and you occasionally have a dialogue option that's specific to them. When you instead bring them along in your party, they talk a lot more, and all of their dialogue is unique and on point for their character. As an example, when you play with Fane in your party, he's hilarious, cataloging things that he doesn't understand about the races that inhabit the land now. But when you play as him, he doesn't do any of that. You can only choose the generic dialogue. Alright, so now onto the mechanical side of the issues. There are a lot of minor glitches in this game, and I'm going to call them glitches and not bugs because I can't tell if they're bugs that are just resolving themselves in some fashion, or if they're deliberate attempts to control some aspect of the game that's going on behind the scenes. A couple of examples: occasionally an enemy gets 2 turns seemingly for no reason. Enemies recover from conditions without suffering any penalties of them, or take far more actions than a player ever can. A lot of them could be some kind of weird math issue, it could be a bug, it could be that my character has some condition that isn't showing up, or it could be that the game is trying to impose a balance by making the enemies more difficult. I have no way of knowing. All I know is that it happens all the time, and it's extremely irritating. One of the glitches I actually had the most fun with is related to the multiplayer. I never played this game multiplayer, but even if you play in single player, it's set up for multiplayer by making each character autonomous. And the reason that that's significant is because if one character is locked into a conversation, the other characters don't necessarily have to be if the game decided they were too far away. So while one character is locked into a conversation or in a battle, you can sneak around with the other characters and meddle with things, or sneak up to enemies and get a free hit in outside of the turn initiative. Like everything else though, it does cause a problem as well, because the game doesn't clearly tell you when other party members aren't in combat, it just shows the symbol next to their picture when they are. And if you didn't notice that one or more of your party members didn't get into the combat, they will just stand around endlessly and never get a turn in the combat until you do notice and move them in. Next on the list is that you have no undo button. And I'm not suggesting that that would be a good feature, but bear with me for a moment. Each turn in combat, you have a limited amount of actions you can take, represented here as these green circles. They're called action points, or AP for short. Barring special circumstances, each character has 4 AP per turn. Moving, attacking, casting a spell, opening a chest, looting, these things all take 1 or more action points during combat. When you go to cast a spell, you click on the spell you want, or use a hotkey, and it will show you the effect it's going to create and how much AP it'll take, and then you click where you want the effect to take place, and then you have to click again to trigger the spell. This is actually fairly intuitive in the game and works very well as a way to prevent you from misusing a spell. The problem here is that moving your character only takes a single click anywhere on the screen, it uses at least 1 action point no matter what, and it cannot be cancelled easily once your character starts moving. You have no way to undo it, and even if your character does little more than fidget in place, it still uses an action point. This is a big problem, because action points can be critical in battles, especially on the harder difficulties, and losing even one of them can mean waiting another turn before using the spell or action that you want. It's especially problematic for archers who may climb down from their height advantage due to an errant click, and next turn you have to get them to climb back up, spending even more action points. This is even doubly irritating because the 3D nature of the game means that it's not always easy to figure out exactly what you're clicking on. Frequently, I would try to click on a monster to attack it, but I would end up clicking the ground next to it, and my character would use an action point, sidestepping, and then I wouldn't even have enough AP to do the attack. On top of all of that, I had so many problems getting the camera to do what I want. Almost every battle would start with me moving and rotating the camera to frame the actual battle so that I could see what was going on. Alright, so let's talk about ice for a moment. Everybody knows ice is slippery, right? Well, this game wants to drill that into your skull and makes absolutely sure that you unequivocally know that. If you ever set foot on an icy surface, your character will fall over and lose the rest of their turn. And since you can't accurately choose the pathing that your character will take, and can't tell them to remember how clumsy they are on icy surfaces, you will fall over constantly if you or your enemy creates an icy surface. It's even worse that I really enjoyed playing the Hydrosophist style class, which basically makes you a water and ice master, but apparently doesn't help your balance at all when you're casually walking across some ice, because even if you're not in combat, if you walk across the ice, your character will fall over and be knocked unconscious for at least 5 to 10 seconds, often multiple times in a row. For those who aren't familiar with this type of game, AoE stands for Area of Effect, and is used when you're talking about an attack that damages more than one person at a time, as opposed to a directed attack which would just hit one. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because the AoE spells in this game are one example of something it does extremely well, but also one of my biggest pet peeves when playing the game. There are an astounding number of spells that you can use, and using them with unique combos to create new effects is extremely satisfying. Here I come across electrified water, which I used fire on to make it electrified steam that hurts anything moving through it. Very cool. The reason it's a pet peeve is because when you're moving around the map, your allies stick very close to you, and generally when combat starts, you're in close proximity to your teammates. Well, enemies are well aware of this, especially on the higher difficulties, and if they get the first turn, they will always use a big AoE spell to start with. Frequently a combination of rain to make water and ice to freeze it, causing you to lose your turn. You do have the ability to set your companions to stand farther away from you, but I don't know which is more annoying, because they don't stand far away when you're walking around, they just move far away when the combat starts, and the game pauses to allow them to move into their positions while you and your enemies wait. And on the flip side of the ice thing, we have fire. My issue with fire is that nearly everything bursts into flames, and I really don't know why. It's like a crazy sci-fi film, the way things just explode all the time. Like, why would poison explode? Very quickly, the entire screen can fill up with fire, and some enemy will inevitably cast Curse on it, which turns it into Necrofire. Necrofire is basically just regular fire, only it can't be extinguished. This is all really obnoxious on its own, but there's a major issue it creates later. There are several enemies called Revenants that show up later, and these aren't particularly difficult enemies on their own, but if they're anywhere near a source of Necrofire, which they start out next to, they will respawn indefinitely. Since they shoot Necrofire arrows, and given how prolific fire is in the game, I don't actually believe there's any way to defeat them without a bit of luck or really jury-rigging the battle. I read online that if you spend a couple turns teleporting them outside away from the fire and kill them before they can take their turn, you can keep them down, but that sounded extremely tedious, and in my playthroughs I just booked it past them. As far as I'm concerned, these are canonically immortal enemies. One of the first things that bothered me while playing this was how healing is handled. Whenever you're done with combat, you'll naturally want to heal your characters back to full health, and since there's no mana or any other spent resource for casting spells, you can heal your characters with spells for free between battles. This may sound great, and for the most part it is, but each time you heal someone, you have to wait for the spell to cool down in order to use it again, and each spell will take multiple casts to heal someone to full. This makes sense in combat, but outside of combat, there's really no reason why you should have to wait for those spells to cool down each time. It might make sense if there was some kind of rush, but since there's absolutely no penalty, it's just pointless. This could be rectified very easily by having your characters automatically heal outside of combat, which most modern iterations of this style of game do, or if you want to keep the healing aspect in, just make spells cool down immediately outside of combat. This would also solve several other issues as well, like waiting for the teleportation spell to cool down when you're using it to explore, or waiting for the rain spell to cool down when you're clearing out a fire or poison. You use these spells a lot outside of combat, and you'll end up spending a lot of time waiting for them to cool down as a result. And you may be thinking that changing this opens up the ability to abuse spells like that, but I actually can't think of any instance where that would happen. And if it could, reducing the timer to 1 second outside of combat would likely solve it anyway. The weird thing is, there are a lot of times, even canonically in the game, where you need to use spells like teleport to move your team, so this isn't something the developers could have overlooked. Teleport is also one of the few spells with another strange limitation, which is that you can never cast it on yourself. And I have no idea why this is a thing. It literally changes nothing about the game, except for adding a time delay. What I mean is, you can teleport other members of your team, and then after you've teleported them, they can teleport you. The first instance of this I remember is in the beginning in Fort Joy. One of the ways of getting through the fort is to collect these gloves that grant you the teleport spell. Then you can find a cliff that would normally block you, and you can teleport a member of your party down to the fort entrance. Once you've done that, you can give that party member the gloves, and they can teleport the rest of the party down there. This is so janky and weird that I thought I was breaking the game. And yeah, I mean, what's the difference between teleporting yourself somewhere and constantly swapping around these teleport gloves aside from inconvenience? Which leads you to the conclusion that all of this is an intentional design choice placed there with the intention of inconveniencing the player as a substitute for a usage penalty. But is this really the best solution they could come up with, to annoy the player for healing or having the audacity to use the teleport spell? The whole situation becomes less and less of a problem the further into the game you get, not the least of which because the level design becomes far less tactical with far fewer puzzles, but a lot of your early game is going to be casting Restoration 2 to 3 times per character to heal them back to full, depending on how the combat-oriented you're playing. This, funnily enough, leads to another weird design choice I found, which is that there are traps in the game. Traps are very common in this style of game, and I'm not saying that they're a bad idea, but traps in this game are always straight damage. There could be fire or poison, explosions, necrofire, but in the end, they only damage your health. And because of that, it's all pointless, since infinite healing and resurrection out of combat, you can just tank the damage or teleport past it, and all it costs you is time. Traps would have caused a lot more trouble in combat, but I don't even remember a single instance where I encountered one in a battle. I'm going to label this next section bullshit you shouldn't have to deal with. I suppose that could apply to a lot of the stuff I've brought up, but these are particularly weird examples. Occasionally, your character will announce that they have found something,
I've spotted something.
and you'll notice a mound of dirt that you can dig up, which only ever contains some loot. But you can only dig it up if you have a shovel somewhere in your inventory. This is an entirely filler item. The shovel has basically no other function in the game except to unlock the dig option. It's not an extremely difficult item to find, nor is it used for anything else in the game, but it's really weird that it's a requirement, and all it means is that once or twice you'll accidentally sell your shovel when you're trying to purge the massive amounts of garbage out of your inventory and not realize it. And then the next time you find a dirt mound, you have to go hunting for a new shovel just to dig it up. The same goes for the magnifying glass. In order to identify magical objects, you need to have the magnifying glass, and it needs to be in the inventory of the appropriate character. While we're on the subject of inventory, let's talk about that for a second, because inventory clutter is as bad as ever in this game. It quickly becomes difficult to find objects in your inventory, and can often be confusing given that you have ostensibly 4 inventories with massive amounts of objects. There's an optional trait that you can take, which is called Pet Pal, and that allows you to speak with animals, so, why would you not want it? This is kind of a cute feature, and it opens up a few side quests, and the reason I added to this section is because there's no reason that you would not take it. A 5% buff to damage will never sound as enticing as opening up a new function of the game, let alone that function is being able to speak to every animal in the game. Any character in your party can take it, so it's really easy to just have one of your companions take it early. In my opinion, this kind of thing should have been folded into something else, maybe Spirit Vision, since that does basically the same thing anyway. And while we're on the topic of Spirit Vision, why do you even need to cast Spirit Vision? Once you have it, it should just be a permanent effect. As I mentioned before, I used a mod for this playthrough which gives you permanent Spirit Vision and Pet Pal, and I found it to be a significantly better experience. When it comes to using Spirit Vision, it's usually fairly obvious when you need to cast it anyway, and otherwise there are a few places you wouldn't normally think to, which amounts to accidentally stumbling over spirits to talk to. It's just an extra step that doesn't add anything to the experience. But that's kind of the point of all of this. Divinity has a ton of things that they added to the game to give it more options, but it all amounts to bloat. As an example, let's circle back to crafting real quick. Crafting is a neat feature in a lot of games, but in Divinity, I don't think it adds anything, and in my first and second playthrough, I never even used crafting once. So you may be thinking, oh, they added an option and you just didn't use it, why is that a bad thing? Well, remember all that inventory clutter I mentioned? Half the junk you find in the world can be used in crafting recipes, so you always want to pick things up that might be rare, leading to a severely overpacked inventory that makes it hard to find things that you actually need. I get the feeling that when Larian came up with this game, they were trying to make it as big as possible, and they wanted to incorporate all of the best features they found in every other RPG. 3D combat and crafting, constantly upgrading your weapons, dynamic terrain, you get the idea. The issue is there's just too much, and none of it feels fully fleshed out or important. It feels like they're modules added to awkwardly expand your options without keeping the integrity of the game together. Let me give you another example. Runes. I didn't even know what runes were on my first playthrough. It probably explained it in a pop-up, but I don't think I ever saw it. And let me explain how these work. You have your normal items, which have a type, an average damage, armor, or shield, and on some specific items there's a slot for a rune, which adds a buff to a weapon or armor. There are some different types of runes and different sizes of each of those runes that grant different stats, and if you aren't happy with the rune that you have, you can always pull it back out of the item. And while we're at it, you can also use source orbs that you find in the world that just give you a different type of buff. And if you aren't satisfied with all of that, you can also find rune frames. There are several different sizes and types of rune frames, which you can socket a rune of various sizes and types into, and then socket the rune frame into a piece of your gear that has a rune slot. You cannot pull a rune back out of a rune frame, however. Some gear have multiple rune slots, so you can have lots of runes and rune frames and source orbs and whatever you want, and it'll all be entirely undermined as soon as you kill another enemy and he drops better gear anyway. I have an entire page full of smaller things that bug me. Several people use the term humanity even when you're not human. People get angry when you read a book that's on a table in public. A couple of times people reference conversations we definitely never had, probably due to the Rails problem. But as this is already dragging on a bit, I think I'll end it here. Thanks very much for watching. Please leave me a comment if you have a suggestion for the next game you'd like me to review. On deck right now I have Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Firewatch.